The disastrous impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine needs little introduction. By this point, several months into the war, we're all very familiar with the realities of it. And the truth is, economically, politically, overall, this has been devastating for Russia. Even when you consider their geopolitical goals, they threw away nearly all the leverage they had with the West. They discarded a lot of their soft power, and nations even like Kazakhstan are now beginning to drift away from Russia and towards NATO and even China for protection. So Putin's special operation, as he calls it, really has not progressed how he would like. Kyiv is still standing, and Ukraine is still surviving. They're fighting back. They're planning a major counteroffensive. Russia's seen the expansion of NATO. They've faced economic devastation, and large swaths of sanctions are already being levied against Russia by the United States, the European Union, and other significant global powers such as the United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea. This, for Russia, is devastating. Their whole economy is based on exporting resources. Natural gas, oil, timber, all these sorts of things. And they are an export-based economy. And sanctions for them are particularly devastating. But as vulnerable as their position is, things can get much worse. Commentators have already regarded the official designation of Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism as the nuclear option, as the most devastating sanctions the U.S. can levy, with significant economic and diplomatic repercussions. And it would levy massively severe sanctions on dual-use exports, which serve both military and civilian purposes. It would require the U.S. to veto the lending of money to the target country, and even more significantly, it would open up the possibility of lawsuits against the state sponsor of terrorism within U.S. courts. And this is something that has just very recently been upheld in a Supreme Court ruling, that you can in fact have these lawsuits against a state sponsor of terrorism in the United States court system. So this is particularly devastating because this opens up a lot of possibilities for judgments and all sorts of funds that are frozen and have been seized to now be claimed by all the various parties that have essentially been wronged by the state sponsor of terrorism. Now, currently, as I'm recording this, Russia has not received this designation, but the U.S. Senate has already passed unanimously a measure urging the Secretary of State to declare Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. The House of Representatives is taking a different approach. So they're just seeking to bypass the State Department entirely and just unilaterally declare Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. And if they're successful, essentially all of the sovereign immunity for Russia is gone. They can be sued in U.S. courts for not only compensation, but for punitive damages. And according to some experts, there's essentially an infinite amount of damages that can be sought against Russia. And as long as the courts keep issuing judgments, Russia's financial ability to operate pretty much anywhere is just done for. They're going to owe billions and billions and billions of dollars in damages. They're going to have no way of being able to repay. But I want to go in a different direction than a lot of these experts are saying. There's not just one nuclear option. And I think there's something that a lot of them really haven't even considered. And that's unleashing the RICO Act. The Racketeer Influence Corrupt Organizations Act is a federal law which, in very, very broad terms, criminalizes activities associated with racketeering. Now, originally, this was a law meant to really target the mafia. Now, the mafia is very transnational. Borders don't really affect the mafia. They operate wherever they want to. The U.S., Italy, all across Europe, all across North America. They'll buy drugs from South America or Asia or the Middle East. They operate everywhere. And RICO was really the first federal law where these jurisdictions can get blurry and the definitions are very vague so that they can sort of target these organizations that don't really operate like traditional crime. They don't really operate in a way that respects borders. So RICO charges are incredibly difficult to defend against, especially compared to other crimes. just because these definitions are very broad, they're very loose. The time span of activities that can be considered racketeering is very, very generous. All you need to do is commit 2 activities from a broad list of activities within a span of 10 years, and you can be charged under RICO. Now, your first thought might be, well, okay, but a lot of these actors in the Russo-Ukrainian war are not necessarily U.S. citizens. They're not in the jurisdiction of the U.S. But the Supreme Court has actually recognized that, in some instances, RICO can be used beyond the U.S.'s jurisdiction. And this has already been upheld by the highest court of U.S. law. Now, a lot of these Russian officials and oligarchs, they have assets in the U.S. They have U.S. bank accounts. They have homes and yachts and all sorts of other things. So there's assets that can be seized. They can be frozen. They can be auctioned off, sold off, all the damages, against various parties. And these can fund that. But even further, if they're going to be charged with racketeering, they have to be very, very careful about where they travel, because a lot of countries have extradition treaties with the U.S., and it becomes very difficult to go anywhere when now all of a sudden you've got racketeering charges against you. Now let's take a moment to read the text of the RICO Act. Now this is from 18 U.S. Code 1962. It shall be unlawful for any person employed by or associated with any enterprise engaged in, or the activities of which affect interstate or foreign commerce, to conduct or participate directly or indirectly in the conduct of such enterprises' affairs through a pattern of racketeering activity or collection of unlawful debt. Now that's admittedly a mouthful, but I broke it down into a bit more simple terms. So to charge someone with violating RICO, to charge someone with racketeering, the government must prove that the defendant was associated with an enterprise. Now, what is an enterprise? We'll get to that in a minute. But for now, they're associated with an enterprise, and that enterprise had an impact on interstate or foreign commerce. The defendant engaged in a pattern of, and I quote, racketeering activities. And the defendant engaged in racketeering activities via this enterprise. So the United States Code defines an enterprise as any individual, partnership, corporation, association, or other legal entity, and any union or group of individuals associated in the fact that although they are not a legal entity. So it's a very broad definition, and that's very key with RICO, is pretty much anything is an enterprise. If you're a political party, you're an enterprise. If you're a business, you're an enterprise. If you're just 3 or 4 random dudes just, conspiring for something, you're an enterprise. Plain and simple. And really, this broad definition is the key to RICO's overall success, is that it's so broad that it can apply to anything. Now, the Russian state itself would technically fall under the definition of an enterprise. It would fall under any other legal entity. It is an entity recognized by law, plain and simple. Russian corporations, oligarchs, political parties, separatist militias, anything they can come up with and that they've funded and anything that they've been associated with, again, is an enterprise under RICO that could technically be targeted. These various entities could be subject to racketeering charges in U.S. courts. They'd essentially be isolated from large swaths of the world. I mean, they got a simple choice here. You can stay at home in friendly countries, or face extradition to the U.S. and imprisonment for racketeering. Their assets could end up being seized and just put to judgments. I mean, for them, really, being under RICO investigation and RICO charges is about the most pain-in-the-ass thing you can get. It just causes so many headaches and so many problems for Russia. So we understand what an enterprise is according to RICO, but what activities fall under this definition of racketeering activities that RICO looks for a pattern of? So there's all sorts of interesting sections in this law that we can go over. I kind of picked some of the most interesting ones that could apply to this conflict and potentially be used to prove a pattern of racketeering. So sections 1581 through 1592, these detail human trafficking, and they could be technically applicable to the trafficking of persons from Ukraine by the Russian government, by these Russian militias. I mean, quasi-states, whatever you really want to call the DPR and LPR, all of that, and any other sort of black market entities, trying to smuggle people and sell them. So all of that would fall under those sections with human trafficking. Sections 1831 and 1832 are probably the most likely to be used in any enforcement of racketeering charges involving violating sanctions or just in general involving the Russo-Ukrainian War. These sections cover economic espionage, the theft of trade secrets, and interference in commerce. And just some examples of scenarios where this might get brought up would be among Putin's parallel import/import substitution schemes and all these other gray market activities to seek to bypass the U.S. sanctions. And then there's the violations of intellectual property laws that, these sort of gray market, black market import schemes involve. Then there's the seizure of leased aircraft from Western nations, and then the illegal blockade of Ukrainian ports. Now, if I had to imagine the exact scenario where this would come to play, I'm very much imagining like the black market import of specialized computer chips, that maybe Russia would use for weapon systems or for supercomputers for explicitly military purposes. And I think in situations like that, all the firms involved, all the individuals involved in, this sort of import parallel scheme would most likely face racketeering charges. Section 2319 further expands upon the intellectual property violations by going into more detail about the criminal infringement of copyright. Section 1956 covers money laundering. 1957 is about monetary transactions in property derived from unlawful activity. And these two could also just kind of be used to cover, in broad terms, some financial crimes, some property crimes. I think this would be used more against oligarchs in particular, but it could also be used against other sort of, sanctions violations, with the exchanging of property as like a sort of middleman, to bypass some sanctions. And then additionally, just to add on, any violations of the Currency and Foreign Transactions Reporting Act would also constitute as racketeering activity under RICO. And the last provisions of RICO kind of expand upon terrorism and how terrorism would be considered a racketeering activity. Now, the federal crime of terrorism has its own broad set of definitions. Pretty much all you need to know is that the following activities under federal law are considered as terrorism. So you've got certain homicides and violence against United States nationals which occur outside of the United States. You've got weapons of mass destruction. So the use of WMDs under U.S. law would be considered as terrorism. You've got acts of nuclear terrorism. You've got harboring terrorists. You've got providing material support to terrorists. You've got providing material support to terrorist organizations. You've got the financing of terrorism. And then you have providing military-style training to a foreign terrorist organization. You got torture, and you've got aircraft piracy. Now, I'm sure you can all imagine different scenarios on how this might affect U.S. trade or U.S. nationals. And there's plenty of scenarios here where, in some cases, commanders of various, Russian units or of the LPR, DPR could in fact face terrorism charges for violence against U.S. citizens, or for using certain weapons of mass destruction, maybe chemical or biological. I don't think nuclear is honestly going to happen. Basically, all you need to know is that the U.S. has a very broad definition of what constitutes terrorism, and these are the activities that fall under it. So RICO charges, plain and simple, they're very hard to escape. There's no immunity to it. There's such a wide net could be cast. Essentially, anyone could be found guilty of RICO charges. Doesn't matter who they are. It could be Putin himself. It could be some members of the Russian Duma, which is effectively their parliament. It could be the leadership of the DPR, the LPR, the quote-unquote People's Republics. It could be different military commanders. It could be business entities, whether these be in Russia themselves, whether these business entities be in other countries like, say, Kazakhstan or China or across Europe, and they're helping to violate the sanctions. They're helping to violate U.S. intellectual property, to violate all these sorts of terms that the U.S. has set out. And essentially, anyone could be government officials who nationalize leased aircraft. It could be pretty much anything. Their assets can be frozen or confiscated, and they're just going to face immense difficulty traveling abroad, like I said earlier, because the U.S. has a lot of extradition treaties. And essentially, if you've got a warrant for your arrest for racketeering, among whatever other charges they throw at you, you're not going to want to travel to any country friendly with the U.S. And this is particularly a problem because it's not just countries that have sanctions against Russia. Even a country that many people see as friendly with Russia, like let's say India. India has an extradition treaty with the U.S. So ultimately, even Russia's so-called allies are not quite as helpful as they always think they are. Now, let's take a moment to talk about the TRIA Act. The TRIA Act, or the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act of 2002, is a post-9/11 bill. It was signed by the Bush administration in response to the September 11th attacks and all the sort of structural problems that existed with the current setup that they had leading up to 9/11. TRIA allows any person that has a judgment against a state sponsor of terrorism or its agents for an act of terrorism, and they have the right to satisfy their judgment by seeking to obtain blocked assets from that party or their agencies within the U.S. So frozen, seized, whatever assets of the Russian state, of the Russian oligarchs, and even some non-Russian individuals and entities that find themselves associated with this, they can all be used to fund judgments against Russia in court. Now, again, this is significant because it's essentially saying it is open season to declare lawsuits and sue, for any sort of damages. And all of these damages against Russia, the seized assets will be used to fund that. So anyone is free, pretty much, if they can prove they've been harmed, just, fire away and try to, claim whatever they can out of the assets. And this could lead to billions and billions and billions of dollars in judgments being issued against Russia and pretty much just all of their assets being liquidated to fund said judgments against them. Now, as far as economic sanctions go, you could argue that the end game would be a full trade embargo. This is pretty much as severe as you can get. It's just cutting off all the trade. All trade between the United States and Russia would just immediately cease. That's it. And while this might seem like the ultimate sanction, the be-all, the end-all, it's not necessarily the most effective route that could be taken, just because you lose that leverage of being able to threaten the full trade embargo. Once you do it, there's really no economic action you can take to escalate. That's it. You've played all your cards. So in a way, having the threat of the full trade embargo without actually going forward with it is the stronger sanction almost, because you can threaten the full trade embargo and try to get some sort of concession out of Russia to not end up implementing it. To say, oh, if you do this, we will do the full trade embargo. So step back while you have the chance. And I have some statistics on the screen just to demonstrate the absolute massive size of the trade between U.S. and Russia. And again, they're not even close to one of our largest trading partners, but it's still absolutely massive. And cutting off that trade would be devastating to Russia. But at the same time, the U.S. has so much leverage to lose by implementing it that I question whether this will ever happen. Now, a lot of people seem to have this view that Russia might actually be doing fine, that sanctions aren't hurting them, and that more sanctions are pointless, that it's not going to hurt Russia, that they'll survive it, that they'll be stronger or whatever. And I think this is a view, really, that is influenced by the Russian propaganda, but it's very, very misguided. For example, I think a lot of it is based on the strength of the ruble, and really this is a currency that is artificially propped up by price controls, by capital controls. There's no liquidity. No one is trading rubles. Rubles, no one wants them, plain and simple. And the outflow of currency is very, very strictly regulated. Basically, you can't get your rubles exchanged into dollars at any genuine market rate. So the Kremlin has taken these really unprecedented measures to prop up this currency, and they're displaying as this huge victory that the ruble is the strongest currency of 2022. But in reality, again, it's worthless because it means nothing. To be the strongest currency with no liquidity, no one's trading it, it means nothing. Absolutely nothing. And, they're trying to prop up their domestic markets and use all these trade restrictions. But it's all artificial, and the house of cards will come crumbling down. But even before it does, the strong ruble, even though it's a great propaganda piece for them, is actually hurting the Russian economy. They're spending up valuable reserves that they only have a limited amount of. And they're spending these foreign reserves to prop up the ruble. They're spending US dollars, they're spending euros, they're spending whatever they can that hasn't already been essentially blocked off. They're spending gold. They're spending whatever they can to push up this currency. But again, it's just hurting them, plain and simple. So a strong currency is actually making Russia's exports less competitive. And mind you, this is an export-driven economy. The Russian economy is based on selling resources to other countries, selling oil, selling natural gas. That is what they do. Now, the benefit of a strong currency would normally be that imports would be cheaper, which on paper sounds great. Cheap imports, it really helps with consumption and all sorts of other things. But the Russian people are not benefiting from that. They're not benefiting from the upside of a strong currency, which is cheap imports, because imports are absolutely plummeting. There's so many sanctions on their country, and so many global firms have left that they're struggling with the supply chains. They're struggling to import anything. And so you have thousands of firms abandoning Russian markets. The prices of everything are soaring due to inflation there. And the cheap imports are not actually materializing. So for Russia, they're getting all the downsides of a strong currency with none of the benefits. And again, just the valuation of the ruble is a fantasy. It's all artificial. And just the restrictions on currency outflow and capital controls are causing this. There is no trade for the ruble. The value of it is imaginary, and I think that really needs to be emphasized. Now, year on year, Chinese exports to Russia have dropped 17% from June 2021 to June 2022. Now, it might not seem like much, but really it is a signal that consumption in Russia is plummeting. They're not able to import, enough goods. There's no confidence in the consumer. And Russia is in a very tight situation with their exports too. Now again, their economy is based on selling gas and oil. But Russia's reportedly giving China and India a $35 discount per barrel of oil sold. And that's compared just to the global market price. Now, this is problematic for Russia because there's already nations that produce oil for considerably cheaper than Russia can. So those nations can essentially drop the price and bleed Russia out just at regular price, at the regular market rate. Now, Russia's issuing a $35 per barrel discount. So Russia's margins are going to become razor thin as oil prices drop. They may even end up having to sell oil at a loss. And they only really have 3 options to choose from in the event that they're not able to profit from oil and they have to sell at a loss. Their options are either to cap their wells, to sell at a loss continually, or to abandon or reduce their discount. Now, let's go over all 3 scenarios. So in the scenario where Russia just decides, hey, we're going to cap our wells, and so be it. So they cap their wells. That alone is an expensive process, and it's not easy to undo in the future. So once they decide to cap their wells, it's going to be very, very difficult for them to increase their production at, some point in the future. So they lower their production, they're selling less oil, but this might raise the prices a bit, and they can close some of the most high cost, drilling centers and close the unprofitable operations. But ultimately, there's some severe long-term consequences in that Russia's ability to produce and ramp up production is severely limited after shutting down the wells. Now, their other option is just to keep selling at a loss. It sucks to sell at a loss, but we have to keep the wells open. We have to keep production up so that in the future, if prices rise, we'll be able to capitalize on it. So they can try to sell at a loss, and they're going to slowly bleed money in the hopes that essentially they can outlast any fall in oil prices. And this would not involve capping wells, but just in maintaining production and kind of hoping and praying that oil prices go back up. So essentially that's just their idea that, hey, sure, we're losing money now, but we think oil's going to go up. We think it's going to be profitable again. We're going to try and ride this one out, and we think we can outlast any fall in oil prices. But there is a considerable risk that this slowly bleeds them out, and that they end up, their producers face bankruptcy, maybe even that the state faces bankruptcy if they're unable to keep up with the taxes. And Russia's going to have this severe issue where they're not going to be able to get debt from Western creditors. So just raising capital is already going to be more difficult. And just to maintain these operations, they're not going to have the parts. They're not going to be able to raise, credit from creditors. And just if oil prices stay low, they're just going to be slowly bled dry. Now, option 3 is they can just say, well, we're not going to do the discount anymore. We're going to lower our discount, or we're just going to abandon it. And this basically just signals to China and India, hey, we can't exploit Russia anymore. And those two are going to move on to the lower cost producers, because Russia's just not going to be competitive with their strong ruble without a discount and with their higher cost to extract oil. They're not going to be competitive, and they're going to lose out on a large amount of those exports. And then they're going to have that problem again where now they have too much oil and no one wants it, and they're probably going to end up having to cap wells in that scenario. So really, it does them no good. And, we can touch on some other industries too. So really, there's just entire industries in Russia that are in complete freefall. Automotive production, as of May 2022, down 75% year on year. Down 75%. I don't think during the Great Depression you could find a single industry down 75% year on year. That is disastrous. Construction down 62% from quarter to quarter going into Q1 2022. And then foreign companies representing 40% of the GDP. That's 1 million jobs. They're minimizing their Russian operations, or they're completely withdrawing from the country. Try to imagine that 1 million jobs are directly being removed from an economy. Now consider that those 1 million people are consuming other goods, they're spending their money, they're contributing the taxes. That is thousands and thousands and thousands of more jobs that were indirectly created that are also going to be lost. The ripple effects are just very hard to even imagine. There's devastating inflation and supply chain issues that are just compounding all these other issues Russia's facing. So many spare parts and other things that they can no longer get. They're going to have to try to produce domestically, that they don't have the production output to even create, that they might not necessarily have the technology to create. And these alternatives are going to be lower quality. They're going to be more expensive because they don't have that economic capability to produce everything. No nation can be entirely 100% self-sufficient. It's never the most efficient path to take. And the sanctions have worked in the past. I think a lot of people have this mindset that Russia can survive. They can survive. Maybe very bare bones, very brutalistic lifestyle, but it's devastating in the long term. Now, consider the 2014 sanctions were quite mild compared to what Russia's facing now. Russia, leading up to 2022, was never even able to surpass their 2014 GDP levels. They had essentially 7 to 8 years of time to rebuild economic growth. They could not achieve their 2014 pre-sanctioned GDP levels. Now consider that really these ones are so much worse, and we have not seen the long-term effects of them. If the 2014 sanctions were just that damaging, I want everyone to try and fathom how damaging long-term the current sanctions will end up being. So admittedly, Russia has a pretty bleak outlook. There's decades of damage ahead, and really no one at this point can deny it. Investors and creditors have a very long memory. They're going to remember how risky Russia is as an investment, and any debt Russia takes out, any leases, any loans, any credit extended to them, they're going to pay massive premiums on it just because they're a very risky country to invest in. They could be sanctioned again. They could go to war again. Maybe they're going to nationalize some industries. Investors price in these risks. And so due to these systemic risks needing to be priced in, Russia's debts are pretty much going to be at junk bond status. That would be my prediction. And Russia's going to find it very difficult, in particular, to lease foreign aircraft in the future. After nationalizing foreign airliners, lenders are going to be very skeptical of leasing again. And any planes that they might be able to lease, they're going to be paying drastically more from it. Drastically more. Because again, it's so risky that there has to be a very good reward for the lender to even consider it. There's just too much risk. And Russia is potentially going to face hundreds of billions of dollars in judgments just from American courts. And they're going to face potential war reparations from Ukraine that, we can only imagine how many billions that's going to be worth. The faith in Russian markets and the Russian ruble, they're not going to repair overnight. There's going to be a strong stigma and skepticism against them. And as for the European Union, never again they're going to go back to purchasing Russian natural gas and oil in the same quantities that they were leading up to this conflict. They were already planning to phase out fossil fuels and transition to a more green future, but in the short term, they're going to be buying from countries like Azerbaijan, maybe Ukraine post-war. They're not going to buy from Russia. Russia is never going to have that same cash flow that they had coming in from these resources after the war. They're never going to go back to that. And they really shot themselves in the foot with that one. There's just no way to say it otherwise. They shot themselves in the foot. They're never going to have that cash flow from these resources ever again. And it's just too difficult to ship to China and India at the same scale that they were able to ship to the EU via these pipelines. So by the time China, shifts to a green future, potentially, they're not going to have that same trade status with Russia that Russia had with the EU previously. So Russia's basically forced post-war to reorient their entire economy that had previously been based on the export of these fuels to Europe, because Europe is not going to buy from them. They lost their largest customer, and this is going to be very damaging. So in short, this is how you destroy an economy. You start a senseless, colonialist war. You project all these imperialist ambitions and you nationalist pride where you say, oh, we're going to have autarky. We don't need the West, but we're still going to have these parallel imports. And sure, just ignore the fact that our oligarchs have yachts in Italy. We're going to be this quasi-fascist regime, but we're denazifying, quote unquote. In short, you destroy an economy by just absolute senseless war senseless disregarding the international order, senseless disregard for just absolute basic logic. It's really baffling that anyone thought this was a good idea. Russia could have played brinkmanship. They could have, made it seem like they were going to do a war and sort of used it to extract concessions. They could have played it fairly smart and actually benefited. But they ended up tossing out all their leverage and essentially destroying their entire economy in wiping out a chunk of their youngest generation, of scarring their neighbor and destroying all relationships with Ukraine for probably the next 50 to 100 years. And what do they have to show for it? Nothing, ultimately. This war was a disaster. It's never served any purpose. And it's unforgivable what happened. It truly is unforgivable. And I don't think that Ukraine, I don't think the West will be able to forgive this for a long time.